So my name is Michelle Wilber. I'm a research engineer with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, which is a research institute with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Although I'm with the team whose offices are down here at UAA. So I'm a longtime Anchorage resident. I grew up here, moved back after school. Although I did go back and get a degree from UAA as well. So proud graduate. My background is mechanical engineering and physics and not electrical engineering, but I really respect the work that electrical engineers do. I started out with ASAP a little over 5 years ago on the solar technologies team. We are an applied research organization that is really interested in being responsive to community needs in Alaska. We do groundbreaking research, but we also do sort of basic vetting and help with technology appropriateness and testing for our communities in Alaska. We do a lot of work with rural Alaska, but certainly are not limited to that. And we love working on projects that have applicability to the wider Arctic, northern regions, high latitudes, and the whole rest of the world where those synergies end up lying. But a few years ago, we really started to get a lot of questions around electric vehicles, knowing that we were engineers. People were asking us, do they work in the cold? Are they applicable to our climate? And so I really started just with literature research, looking at that question and getting the anecdotal stories from people who were driving full battery electric vehicles in Alaska already in -40-degree weather. And that kind of all came together in a number of research projects that we have funded. But one of the biggest looking directly at electric vehicles is NSF Navigating the New Arctic funded project. And it is, as all the Navigating the New Arctic projects are, multidisciplinary, community focused, hopefully community led in many ways with what those questions are. And we have a team that's composed of social scientists. I know nothing about people. I used to be a physicist, and so really ignored that people existed. I guess as an engineer, I have to admit that they exist, and we might want to, sort of take them into account, but still don't know all the ways to obtain that. So when you see results about the perceived barriers and benefits of electric vehicles, that's all thanks to Jen Schmidt, my Institute for Social and Economic Research co-researcher. But we started off with a planning grant to really look into some of those questions. What are the community-driven questions and worries and hopes for electric vehicles? And so how can we tailor our engineering and other research, moving ahead, to meet those needs? And we specifically were working in 3 communities: Kotzebue, Galena, and Bethel. So 2 more coastal West Coast type communities and an interior community, different amounts of installed renewables, all basically diesel microgrids of a few hundred to a few thousand people. They all have some limited road systems. There are communities that just have boardwalks or wet tundra out the door. And so there are no trucks and cars in some communities in Alaska, but these all have the ability to support conventional vehicles as well as a large amount of unconventional boats, snow machines, four-wheelers, and other transportation choices, and subsistence lifestyles, people that are not as much a part of the cash economy, other people who are working for the city or the tribe or National Park Service. So just a wide range of uses. So in this planning phase, we really just met with the community, with our partners there, with people we knew that worked for different organizations, the electric utilities, of course, and the general public, bribed with the usual pizza and cash if you come to our meeting and answer some questions for us. So in many ways, that's still pretty conventional social science research. The Navigating the New Arctic as a whole is really looking at ways to make this more community driven and less sort of researcher driven, drive people to come to your meeting. But we don't have all the answers yet. We're still figuring it out. Hopefully those that take over from me and my coworkers in the next generation will do a better job. But in any case, over the 2 years prior to 2024, we held a number of community meetings, 3 in each community, plus some additional time in town and some workshops and did something called a max diff exercise. Like I said, I'm no social scientist, but it was a way to get at some of the biggest barriers people see to communities in rural Alaska. And it looks like I'm helping this guy, but really he's helping me understand what the barriers would be to him. So again, really focused on what are the real needs, not what are those of us in our, ivory towers who want to crunch some data. What do we think the important factors are? And I should say that there are some electric vehicles, an electric vehicle in most of these communities. There are only, as far as I know, hybrids in Bethel, although I think somebody had a small battery electrical vehicle that went out of the community at some point in the past. The utility in Kotzebue has a Nissan Leaf. They bought it used. It's been operating just fine in the community for a number of years, although they finally winterized the whole starter battery and put some chains on so they can drive it better in the winter. And there's a Tesla in Galena that somebody barged in there. So there are vehicles in each of these communities, but they are definitely late adopters as a whole. There are not many. There's not a lot of strong interest right now, but the question is, if this technology is rolling forward, what do we need to do to make sure that people are ready for that transition, and that any of the specific challenges have been thought about and some of those needs have been met. So we put a bunch of things that we thought of ahead of time on the questionnaire about what your biggest fears were. And they're all the normal things: range of travel, what do you do with the battery at the end of its life, how much is your electricity going to cost, things like that. But we also asked for people to weigh in with other things that we hadn't put down there. And some of those things are a little derivative maybe of some of those bigger categories. But you can see that there's a lot of specific questions around parts, access to parts. There is no mechanic in Galena. You do your own, or you give somebody a part of a moose for them to fix your car. So can you do stuff yourself? How do you get the parts to do it yourself? How do you not shock the heck out of yourself while you're doing it? So lots of questions there. Roads are bad, so they're worried about anything that's at all fragile. When it's 40 or 50 below, parts get really brittle. So, questions around that. Weight of the vehicle is a big question because shipping is by weight. And so if you're paying $5,000 to $10,000 to ship in a conventional vehicle, what happens when it weighs more because of a big battery? And then what about the hazmat part of that and all of that? So lots of interesting questions I wouldn't have even thought of, but can really start to inform what we do as researchers. And so we also did a short informational, this is how electric vehicles are working for other people in Fairbanks, where it does get to 40 below, here's what's happening to range and things like that. And it alleviated some concerns. So there's a before and after on that exercise. And cold weather performance, for instance, went down as a fear when people heard that other people were driving their cars in the winter with, the normal range problem decreases, but often not much worse than that. And the fear of breaking down and some other things like that, range anxiety, but other things rose in importance to make up for that. And one of the biggest factors we kept hearing was the local ability to maintain the vehicle. So that will inform some of what we do in the next phase of that project. That's just when you break it down by community, just showing that different communities have some different fears, and we can tie those to some specific things about the communities. Galena has a 14-mile road between Old Town and New Town. So the battery capacity, which is kind of derivative of range of travel, but they were a little more worried because they drive a bit more there in general about running out of battery capacity. The other thing is there is very little known about vehicle use in rural communities. What is that energy component? How big is it? How far are people going every day? What all are they using their vehicles for? So we're going to take a better stab at this with trackers and surveys in the whole project. But in this phase, we did ask people to list all the types of vehicles they use, four-wheeler, snow machine, boat, whatever. And then list all the things they do with their vehicles. So those categories were all generated by the communities: errands, joyriding, commuting, going to a beach barbecue, trail staking, search and rescue, hauling freight, subsistence activities, heading to another community. Those are all generated by them. And then we put up a few different time steps or whatever to see how often they use them, and knowing kind of how far it is to the beach can allow us to put a distance on that. If you know mileage, you can kind of get what the energy use for their current vehicles might be. And then we asked people based on those listings to put dots on the activity, time period, and vehicle they use most often. So everybody got 3 dots, and then to put a color dot on them if they were willing to use an electric vehicle for that purpose. Not at all ever willing to use an electric vehicle for that purpose. We got that a lot for like search and rescue on snow machines. They didn't want to deal with new technology for that critical endeavor, or a yellow dot for I'm not quite sure. And so we assume there was a lot of bias to who decided to come to a community workshop on electric vehicles, even if you were bribed with pizza and $20 at the end of the meeting. A lot of people were willing to try an electric vehicle for many purposes. So maybe not as much resistance as we expected to see in the community towards at least entertaining the thought of this transition. And we then asked, here's all these barriers, what about benefits? And people were really interested in, cleaner town, potentially lower fuel, certainly maintenance costs, noise, things like that. Not huge surprises, but it's nice to see them ranked by what the community thinks is most important. And we winnowed this down a little bit further with actually the most participation we ever got. We went to the Chamai Dance Festival in Bethel, which gets people from all the surrounding communities to come in. It's a big festival, and we had a booth, and people came by and voted with their pennies on which of the 3 top barriers and benefits they thought were most important. So we're going to go with the biggest barrier being the high cost of electricity in rural Alaska, and the biggest benefit folks see is cleaner air, but all of the other categories being important too. So like I said, I've done the literature research, and we have a kind of an extensive report, but it's getting a little dated and old, and that was at the beginning of my foray into looking into electric vehicles as a whole. So there may be some things my thinking's involved on. But we put together what Alaskans maybe should know about electric vehicles for our region, for cold regions. And we've gone on to collect data from vehicles operating in the state, mostly Teslas and Fairbanks, but some other vehicles in some other locations. And we're hoping to collect more data through the research phase of the AVITA project. In the range of temperatures we see, it's pretty linear. We don't have a lot of hot temperatures, so we don't get that air conditioning, high energy use and hot weather side of that curve very much. And at -40, there's very little published data below -20 Celsius, pretty much none below -30 Celsius. So we extended that record down to -40. We're not seeing a tailover. At some point, those heaters are going full out and you can't get any more energy out, and you're going to see that curve tail off and not be so linear at the end. We're not seeing it. There's, of course, a huge amount of scatter because how you drive, where you're driving, what tires you have on your car, wind resistance, so many, how fast you're going, all kinds of things matter in that energy use, but you can pick out trends. And then another thing that we haven't seen much in the literature, but our friends at Chugach Electric Association here really turned me on to, they did some work where they plugged the car in to charge to full, restarted the charging session, and recorded all the energy use overnight to sit out parked in the cold in Anchorage, which only gets to about, -20 Celsius in most winters is about as cold we get. We got down to -20 Fahrenheit. Somebody quickly do the math this winter, but we don't get very cold anymore. But in any case, we did get some data points on how much energy at least their vehicle, a Chevy Bolt, was using to keep its battery warm and happy while plugged in, while parked outside in some pretty cold weather. And if you extend those trends and try to back some data out of the Teslas we have, and also look at warm idling or warm up data. So what happens if you press the warm up your car button or sit there in a warm car? You're not, you don't have an engine going, you're not idling in the traditional sense, but you're still using those electric heaters to keep the car warm and maybe keep that battery warm. How much energy does that use? And that becomes a big factor for vehicles that aren't driven very much, but are parked out in really cold weather. So we've taken all the data we've collected so far and put together a calculator that you can find at that web address there. It's specific to Alaska, although the backend is all available on GitHub with all the relations and assumptions. And I've got a paper and review that hopefully will get published in Fuel, whatever the special issue is, at some point, that talks about building this calculator. And we really worked with our communities and our stakeholders to try to make it easier to use, because I am a huge data nerd and I would love to put in every little factor and get everything out. And my social science partner at least was like, no, you have to have most of this default and just put in a couple things or nobody will ever use it. So it's got room for lots of improvement, but we're working on it both in the back end, the data, the relationships, the models, and also in the front end usability. But we're heading there. So there are 4 inputs you choose, and then there's some backend stuff that you can click on and adjust if you want to. And if you look at typical output for our typical cold rural communities in diesel dominated microgrids, and actually even on the North Slope and some of our gas generated microgrids, because those gas generators are small and very inefficient. You see that a lot of times the electric vehicle does not save anybody money and does not save carbon emissions. It can be worse because of those extreme conditions and the use cases. The more somebody uses the vehicle and drives it, the better that case becomes. But if they only go to the store and back, and that's like a 4-mile round trip, and that was their day's drive, and the rest of the time it's sitting parked out at -30 or something, then there's a lot of that blue bar energy use just for staying parked. And then the orange bar, this is kind of a typical use case in Kotzebue, is driving, and then idling depends on how much if they're idling. It could be really big or it might be small if you're trying to save energy and not keep your car warm. So that's a typical result. And there are cases where it works out great in rural Alaska, even with diesel generated microgrids and cold temperatures. And there are other use cases where it doesn't turn out at this point to save anybody money with current technology. This is a really confusing plot that I'm not going to go into great detail because I'm going to run out of time pretty soon. But it looks like we are hoping to deploy an electric ATV and snow machine, and we are moving forward on research with Kotzebue and Galena. We had the strongest community buy-in from those communities, or desire to move forward with the project. Bethel, there are some great people there, but we just didn't form that research coalition. We are planning to deploy with our partners in those communities an electric ATV and snow machine at some point in the future. The Polaris side-by-side is available, but a little beyond our budget. We were kind of budgeting for cheaper our four-wheelers. We'll see, maybe that's what we go with. There's a Taiga snow machine on the market. Polaris says there's not enough demand for snow machines, so they're not really moving forward with that development. The Taiga is not being sold in our region yet. Problems. We'll figure it out. We got a couple of years before we're off schedule, but we want to collect some real data. Right now, this is how many miles you drive per day, and common in rural Alaska is somewhere between 4 and 10 miles a day, or maybe 4 and 20 miles a day. You know, if you're looking at places like Galena, where there is a distance between 2 parts of the community. But beyond that is really pretty rare, unless you're a taxi driver or a food delivery driver, or a tribal vehicle that gets used to run people back to the airport and gear down to the boat dock or whatever over and over again. So there's some cases there, but really common is down here. And then this is the cost one. So percent difference in fuel costs between a gas vehicle and electric vehicle. So anything above 0 is you're saving money. Anything below 0 is you're spending more money to fuel the electric version, according to our model. And with the data we can get online about ATV use, and even kind of assuming some battery heating, it's looking like that might be an above the board, always good option, potentially. We don't have real data. Snow machine, that's kind of iffy. If you're not driving it very many miles, that energy used to keep the battery healthy may be a problem. And then cars and trucks are the same thing. It depends on the use case. It depends on the energy mix in the community, and well, in this case, prices. Energy mix is the carbon emissions benefits. So it's a mixed bag. However, the more renewables you install, potentially, the better your emissions are for charging that vehicle on that grid. So and there may be some synergies with managed charging to use up excess wind or something like that. And the cost is all dependent on what the utility rate structure is. And often we're assuming that you can't take advantage of the state, call it a subsidy. I get a lot of pushback from my rural partners about calling it a subsidy, but power cost equalization brings down the cost to households and some community uses of power. And if you can extend those PCE rates to all of your charging, that may overbalance the cost picture there. So like I said, we are continuing forward. We're working with UAA's Community and Technical College Automotive Department, who's developing a certificate for EV maintenance. We're working with them and the school districts in our communities to develop workforce development curriculum, intro level curriculum around electric vehicles. What is electricity, safety, what can you do to wrench on them without getting into trouble? Like, can you change your tires over to snow tires? Yeah, we could probably do that. So that's being developed as part of this. We're also going to deploy those off-road vehicles I mentioned so that we can get some real data, and we're collecting data on other conventional vehicles in the state to broaden that database. And more of those topics. And Mohammed is actually helping us, and a student that's coming online with looking at how the power grid needs and the electric vehicle charging needs will interact, and what things do we need to keep in mind as far as hosting capacity and transformer limits and everything else at the charging sites, but also can we use those as a resource for the grids. And so just visual slide on all of those. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So we have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions maybe, and then we will get Regan to lead a discussion. So do we have a couple of specific questions on the AT vehicles?
So I'll start. So Michelle, what is your belief after doing this work in terms of whether there will be solutions that make sense or electric vehicles adopted in rural Alaska?
Well, okay, so if you were to look at my M1 investment account from when I got bored during COVID and everybody was like, you can invest in stocks on this online platform, and you were to look at what happened to them with time, you would not trust anything I say about the future at all. So I have no ability to predict the future, and like things like interest rates staying high, nobody wanted to invest in renewable energies is problematic for that. But anyway, I think that the transition to electric vehicles has so much momentum behind it that it's happening, it's going to happen. It makes so much sense for almost all other parts of the world. I think that there are big opportunities. Kotzebue is looking at, they have 30% of their generation from wind and solar right now, offsetting diesel. They would like to get much higher penetrations, and they're very actively looking at right now electric heating, dispatchable electric heating, even in people's houses, but they're doing very active research on, is it long duration energy storage or is it managed electrical loads? Lardo is helping look at some home level management of electrical loads to better match loads with generation. And so there's a lot of opportunities there as a big battery driving around on wheels to use that to clean up the, allow the transition to these cleaner sources of generation to do it more cost effectively and to pass on those cost savings to the end user. So I think there's a path forward there. I think there are some other innovative things that could be done, like with ATVs that are a very, very popular form of transportation for people even just taking the kids to school, not even heading off to across the tundra for hunting, to have a business model like they do in Africa where somebody owns the batteries and you swap out batteries and maybe those are stored in some small warm storage because nobody has garages and charged up there. I think there's a lot of ways to make it work cost effectively, carbon reduction wise. But it's going to be a little outside the box. And does that mean it's going to be cost effective when the economies of scale are what is really bringing down the cost of electric vehicles? I mean, there's battery technologies that are better for the toll, but we're such a small demand for those that they're not the mass produced diving down in cost systems yet.
So the batteries that you studied so far, probably all lithium-ion chemistries?
Yeah, we're looking at conventional vehicles. We're not at this point trying to reinvent the wheel, and they are all lithium-ion.
So you probably have the best data because you have the coldest temperatures. Yeah. What's the average degradation, during a winter day in Alaska on a car that just sits, it's not being used? It has to be warmed up. The battery has to be warmed, otherwise the anode and the cathode will fuse. What is the average degradation just because of that heater? never mind the
Yeah,
temperature.
and you mean, like not degradation of the battery, but reduction in range?
Yeah,
or
because
reduction in
yeah, so if
capacity?
that, if the
Yeah.
car sits, if it sits in the cold, they have to
Yeah.
keep it above 32 degrees, right?
Well, so it's a little, so it's like studying wildebeest you know, like whoever made the wildebeest knows exactly what their internal algorithm and, you know, heat sources are and stuff, but you're just trying to absorb how much they eat, and what that means for their energy needs. So if somebody at Tesla would tell me, or all the car companies, this is how big our battery heater is, this is how we're moving the heat around, this is our algorithm for what temperature we turn it on and off, then I could just do all this from first principles. Like you said, I'm collecting the data, and the vehicles I'm looking at so far, which are mostly passenger sedan style, or, you know, what people are calling SUVs that aren't real
Off-the-shelf
SUVs.
stuff.
Yeah, off the shelf stuff. It does depend a little bit. It seems like they all have different amounts of energy use and different set point temperatures, and it depends on if they're plugged in or not. Some of them don't seem to use that battery heater very much at all if the car isn't plugged in. And then you press the on button and it might tell you it needs 20 minutes to get ready to go. So they do have battery heaters. They do have whatever methodology they use to use them and whatever temperature they're aiming for. It looks like generally they're, so the lithium ion batteries that they're using freeze at -20°C. So undoubtedly they're all trying to keep them above that. It looks like the bolts at least are trying to keep the battery when it is plugged in and it has unlimited juice at about 32 to 35 Fahrenheit, so just above freezing. Sorry to mix units. My data comes in all different units, so my brain's sticking on different things, but it looks like the question you're asking of, well, you weren't asking how much range is lost. In the end, a lot of what I get is just how many kilowatt hours did it take to do that trip? And I'm not myself particularly interested in the range. I'm interested in the energy use, so I can pull that back to grid impacts. But the range reductions are up to 50% or more on a really cold day, as far as how much distance people go before they need to recharge, and how much of that is an inoptimal temperature of the battery leading to lower capacity, and how much of that is just the energy going to the heating to keep it at a more optimum temperature, more optimal capacity, is something that is invisible to in my data sets.
And heating your passengers too.
And that's the biggest use. I mean, the battery heater is somewhere, they're usually separate. That one is usually under 2 kilowatts in size, and the compartment heater looks like it's around 7 kilowatts or so, at least with the fan. You know, that may be including energy for that fan blowing around, and I don't know, whatever other peripherals people had on while the data was being gathered, like radios and lights, but yeah.
Well, one more, last one.
That's just kind of more of a comment along this topic. When I grew up in Bristol Bay, you know, which would have been Dillingham,
Yep.
Gig, Nagnig,
Yep.
those places. And I found that, you know, when we lived in Dillingham, we drove cars and trucks. They were really beat up cars and trucks.
Heater with the heater.
Yeah, sometimes they didn't even have that, but it was very common out in places like Iquique and others. People rode around in 4-wheelers and 3-wheelers along, and even in Dillingham they did that. And I know that, you know, some rural communities, they've kind of relaxed the rules for what you could drive on the road. And the kind of environment you see in a lot of these towns, these communities, is more similar to what you'd see in a rural developing country than what you would see in urban America or Canada or anywhere else really.
Yep.
And the kind of vehicles that are available to us are not built for that. So you buy a car that's got panels that are made of plastic and everything else, and you take it out there, and in 3 years you've just trashed it. And you got a dashboard half lit up with lights because sensors have failed and you can't replace them and everything else. And it would almost make sense from this standpoint, from a practicality standpoint, to focus on off-road vehicles in some of these places if that's a thing. And because some of the safety concerns that mandate a lot of these extra stuff that make us put on our vehicles, it's not that they don't exist, it's the risk factors are different. You're going to be wrecking that, well, unless you're just a maniac, which I am.
I was gonna say,
You're going to be wrecking at 35 miles an hour instead of 75 miles an hour.
right,
you
right,
know, and
right.
there's not as much traffic and not as much of a chance for collision that might deploy 6 of your 7 airbags.
Oh,
So-
people don't even use seatbelts, so why do you need airbags? Just kidding. I'm sorry.
No, you're not wrong. You're not, so, you know, you have a lot of the trucks in Dillingham, no joke. They actually have like a bench seat bolted to the pickup bed and facing rearward.
Yeah.
And that's what people ride on to and from the net locker some
Yeah.
places. So
I'll be in Dillingham on Sunday for the rest of this week.
I grew up there, so
Yeah,
tell them hi for me.
So, yeah, Chandler just brought his Nissan Leaf out there. He debated long and hard when he moved out to take the sustainable engineering professor job at Brooks Bay campus, but he brought it out a little over a year ago, and I think it's doing good, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hear over and over, like, and so this is like a concern people have with any new technology, 4-stroke snow machine over 2-stroke and all the new electronics on the snow machines. The thing is it's like the vehicles, you know, they buy the most used, most, like you said, cheap, beat up, vehicle, and a vehicle that goes out there never comes home again. As long as it runs, somebody's driving it. But the vehicles that people can buy, the vehicles being brought in by National Park Service or by somebody who has a good job and, you know, once they're super, they are newer vehicles that have all those electronics anyway. And the snow machines and even the Polaris side-by-side is, you know, I'm talking energy use and he's like, oh yeah, well, you can get the cabin heater for your side-by-side with your windows and then the energy use on our electric one goes way up and, you know, there's all the bells and whistles and all the things you can get so I hope, and I know what you're saying about regulation, like if a vehicle isn't regulated to highway speeds, then maybe there will be models available you can purchase that have less of those bells and whistles, but the whole direction of vehicles is going more electronic, more complicated, more bells and whistles.
We look at retirement communities in Arizona, you know, you got a lot of people driving golf carts on the roads as long as they don't go on the freeways and stuff. And I don't know if there are any policy impediments right now because it's been a while since I looked into any of that. I don't know, maybe something to look into.
Yeah, well, that's why that's a big part of our project is to deploy those vehicles and look at it because it is, you know, you don't need to register your vehicle in many of the communities in Alaska, and there are many communities with really light requirements for what can be on a road. But you know, you definitely, you know, there are a lot less requirements to driving a 4-wheeler around, and they tend to be cheaper. Depends, you know, if you can buy a used truck for cheap that's still running. But so there are a lot of 4-wheelers used for daily transportation in many communities.
They don't burn much gas either.
Their fuel efficiency is not great. I was really surprised when I looked into it. Like 15 miles per gallon.
Which one's driving it?
Yeah, it's not amazing. I thought it would be way better than it was. Snow machines are bad too.
So,
Anyway, I'd use some more than.
well, let's give Michelle a hand.